Ricardo walked out of his office building, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The city bustled around him, cars honking, people moving briskly with purpose, the chatter of street vendors calling out to passers-by. His suit was crisp, dark blue, the kind that exuded authority. His phone buzzed incessantly with emails and meeting reminders, but Ricardo paid no attention. He had mastered the art of appearing unbothered. His face was set in stone, no smiles, no eye contact. He was in control. He was heading to the upscale cafe he frequented every morning. There, the aroma of expensive coffee would mix with the laughter of well-dressed professionals. It was his daily routine, a moment to collect himself before the whirlwind of meetings, negotiations, and boardroom battles that defined his day. Nothing about this morning seemed different, until he saw her. She was sitting on the sidewalk, her hair matted, clothes dirty and torn. She held a small cardboard sign, "Please, I need help." Ricardo slowed for a moment, her presence interrupting his usual march. The woman's eyes met his, tired, desperate, pleading. Her voice was barely a whisper, but loud enough to reach his ears. "Sir, could you spare some change? Anything helps." Ricardo stared at her for a heartbeat longer than he intended. Something in her eyes seemed familiar, almost haunting. Then he shook his head slightly, adjusted his suit jacket, and continued walking. He had no time for distractions. People like her were always there, blending into the background of the city's chaotic life. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't save everyone. He convinced himself he was doing her no harm by ignoring her. He was just one man, and she was just another stranger. Reaching the cafe, Ricardo stepped inside and let the door close behind him, cutting off the sounds of the outside world. He ordered his usual, a double espresso, and watched as they prepared it. The barista handed it to him with a smile, which Ricardo returned with a polite nod. He took a sip, feeling the warmth spread through him. The bitterness of the coffee calmed him. He turned his thoughts back to his upcoming meeting, trying to shake the lingering image of the woman on the sidewalk. In the office later that morning, Ricardo found himself struggling to focus. The room was full, his team talking numbers, projections, the usual. His thoughts drifted back to her, those eyes, the trembling voice. He shook his head slightly, forcing himself back into the present. He had no space in his mind for distractions, not with the government regulators breathing down his neck. The financial investigation had begun to cast a shadow over his once unstoppable business. The auditors were looking for any reason to bring him down, and Ricardo knew it. His investors were getting nervous, and the pressure was on. Losing wasn't an option. He needed to be sharp, focused. Any sign of weakness, and it would all fall apart. Ricardo brushed off the uneasy feeling, deciding to deal with the pressing matters at hand. He ended the meeting early, irritated with his team's inability to come up with a solution for their current problem. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice colder than he meant. He could see the discomfort in their eyes, but he didn't care. Ricardo prided himself on his strength, his ability to take charge when everyone else faltered. As the day turned to night, Ricardo found himself alone in his luxurious apartment. The silence was almost overwhelming. He poured himself a drink, staring out of the vast windows overlooking the city. Below, the world kept moving, people rushing, cars crawling along the road, lights flickering. He thought back to his mother. She had always helped others. He remembered her organizing food drives, collecting clothes for the homeless. She had died young, and Ricardo had tried to forget that part of her. Kindness was weakness. It got you nowhere in the cutthroat world he lived in. He had decided that after her death, but her image lingered tonight, just like the woman's eyes had lingered with him all day. He downed the rest of his drink, shaking his head as if trying to physically dislodge the thoughts. His phone buzzed, an email reminder about the new regulations affecting his company. He sighed and turned away from the window. Work. He could lose himself in work. The next day, Ricardo took his usual route to the office. The city moved around him, a machine that never stopped, everyone with somewhere to be. He spotted her again, the woman from yesterday. She was in the same place, sitting on the sidewalk, her sign still in hand. This time, she wasn't looking at anyone. Her head was lowered, her shoulders slumped in defeat. He could hear her weak voice as he approached, asking for help, the words now strained as if she had been repeating them endlessly. Ricardo's jaw tightened. He didn't slow down, didn't look at her. He stepped past her like she was invisible. His heart thudded, a strange anger rising in him, not at her, but at the discomfort she made him feel. He hated it. He hated the reminder of something he had tried so hard to bury. He hated how her presence poked at the cracks he tried so hard to seal. As Ricardo entered his office, he threw himself into his work, hoping to drown out any thought that wasn't about numbers, deals, or strategy. But the image of the woman seemed to cling to his thoughts, an echo he couldn't shake. Her eyes, her outstretched hand, her voice asking for help. He ignored the feeling gnawing at him, choosing instead to focus on the latest report that crossed his desk. Ricardo's assistant knocked and entered his office. "Sir, you have a call from the government auditor," she said, her voice careful, almost afraid of how he might react. Ricardo nodded curtly, signaling her to leave as he picked up the phone. The auditor's voice was cool, professional, and straight to the point. They were tightening the noose. They wanted documentation, evidence of compliance, and they wanted it fast. He felt his stomach twist, but he kept his voice steady, promising to get everything they needed. He hung up, rubbing his temples. It wasn't supposed to be like this. As he left the office that night, Ricardo walked past the spot where she had been. She wasn't there. He paused, his eyes searching the empty space. For a moment, he almost felt relieved, but the relief quickly turned into something else, something uncomfortable. He turned away, heading to his car, telling himself it didn't matter. She didn't matter. He had bigger problems. But no matter how much he tried to convince himself, Ricardo couldn't help but feel that something was shifting inside him. He had ignored her twice now, and both times, it felt like he was walking away from more than just a stranger on the street. It felt like he was walking away from something he couldn't quite name, a piece of himself he had forgotten, a part of his past that refused to be buried. Ricardo's office was buzzing with the usual morning chaos. He sat at his desk, trying to focus on a set of financial statements when his assistant entered, Ike, looking pale. "Mr. Ricardo, have you seen the news?" she asked, her voice unsteady. Ricardo glanced up, frowning. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated, then placed a tablet on his desk. The screen lit up with a news headline: "Homeless woman found to be missing heir of powerful investor, shunned by prominent businessman." Ricardo felt his stomach drop. He stared at the screen. It was her, the woman he had ignored twice now. She was sitting on the sidewalk in the photo, the same pleading eyes, and next to her, a headline that spelled trouble. "Who reported this?" Ricardo asked, his voice low but edged with tension. "It's everywhere, sir. Social media, news websites. It's gone viral." She shifted uncomfortably. "They're calling you out for refusing to help her." Ricardo clenched his jaw, dismissing his assistant with a wave. He scrolled through the news article, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger. The story painted him as a villain, someone who had coldly ignored a woman in desperate need. Worse, the article revealed she was an heir to a significant estate, left behind by an influential investor who had recently passed away. The irony was palpable. Ricardo's phone started buzzing. He knew it was only a matter of time before the damage to his reputation started to spread. Clients would see this. Investors would question him. He could already imagine the uncomfortable phone calls. He needed to fix this, and fast. That afternoon, Ricardo found himself in his car, heading toward the part of town where he had seen her. He wasn't sure what he would do, but he knew he needed to try to make things right, or at least appear to do so. He couldn't let this story be the reason his company fell apart. He spotted her sitting near the same spot, her back against a brick wall. Her sign was lying on the ground beside her. She looked even more worn out than before. Ricardo parked his car and walked over, drawing some glances from pedestrians. He straightened his suit, clearing his throat as he approached her. "Excuse me," Ricardo began, his voice softer than usual. The woman looked up, her eyes narrowing when she recognized him. "You again?" she said, her voice carrying exhaustion and a hint of annoyance. "What do you want?" Ricardo hesitated. He wasn't used to this kind of situation. He wasn't used to feeling out of his depth. I wanted to apologize. I didn't realize." "Didn't realize what?" She cut him off, her tone sharp. "That I was a human being. That I needed help." She shook her head, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "Or is it because you found out who I am now?" Ricardo took a deep breath. This was going worse than he expected. "Look, I just want to help. I can provide you with money, shelter, whatever you need." She laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "You think you can just throw money at this and make it go away? You think that's what I need?" Ricardo could feel people stopping to watch. His face burned with embarrassment. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm serious. Let me help you." "No," she said firmly. "You're not here for me. You're here for you. For your image." She stood up slowly, her eyes locking onto his. "I don't want your money. I don't want anything from you." She turned and began to walk away, leaving Ricardo standing there, stunned. He watched her disappear into the crowd, his hands clenched at his sides. The people around him were murmuring, some taking pictures. He could already see the headlines forming. "Businessman rejected by homeless heiress." Ricardo turned and walked back to his car, his heart pounding. This wasn't just about a news story anymore. She had seen right through him, and she was right. He hadn't come here for her. He had come here to save himself, his company, his reputation, and now he was left with nothing. The next day, Ricardo sat in his office, staring at his phone. He had already received calls from several clients, one of whom had decided to pull their investment. The client had been polite but firm, explaining that they didn't want to be associated with someone who treated people so poorly. Ricardo had tried to reason with them, but it was no use. The damage was done. He threw his phone onto his desk, leaning back in his chair. His office, once a place of confidence and control, now felt stifling. The walls seemed to close in around him, the pressure mounting with each passing hour. There was a knock on the door, and his assistant peeked in, looking hesitant. "Sir, there's a situation with your son. He just called." Ricardo straightened, his heart sinking. "What do you mean?" "He wants to move in with his mother. He said he's not comfortable staying here after everything that's happened." Ricardo felt a sharp pain in his chest. His son, the one person he thought he could always count on, was leaving. He nodded, dismissing his assistant once again. He didn't want anyone to see the look on his face, the mixture of anger, hurt, and helplessness. He sat there, alone, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The company was in crisis. His son was leaving. The media was tearing him apart. For the first time in years, Ricardo felt like he was losing control of everything he had worked so hard to build. He picked up the bottle of whiskey he kept in his desk drawer and poured himself a glass. He stared at the amber liquid, his hand trembling slightly. He had built his life around power, money, and control. He had sacrificed everything for success, his relationships, his happiness, his humanity. And now, it was all slipping away. Ricardo drank deeply, the burn of the alcohol doing little to numb the pain he felt inside. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He could see her face again, the woman on the sidewalk, her eyes filled with anger and pain. He had tried to help, but it hadn't been enough, and maybe it never would be. He put the glass down, rubbing his face with his hands. He needed to think. He needed to figure out a way to fix this. But for the first time, Ricardo wasn't sure if he could. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling, and he was terrified of what lay beyond them. That night, Ricardo returned to his apartment, but it didn't feel like home. The space was cold, empty. He walked through the rooms, the silence pressing in on him. He paused by his son's bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Inside, everything was neatly arranged: his son's books, his guitar, the small collection of photos on the nightstand. Ricardo stepped inside, his chest tightening. He picked up a photo of the two of them, Ricardo and his son, smiling, standing by the lake on a summer vacation years ago. He barely recognized himself in the picture. He looked happy, carefree. He set the photo down gently, his eyes stinging. He knew he couldn't keep living like this. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that he was fine. He had lost touch with the things that really mattered, and now he was paying the price. Ricardo sank down onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He had tried to fix things with money, with power, with control, but none of it had worked. The truth was, he didn't know how to fix this. He didn't know how to make things right. He sat there for a long time, the weight of his failures pressing down on him. And for the first time, Ricardo allowed himself to feel it all: the regret, the guilt, the fear. He let the tears come, silent and heavy, as he realized just how far he had fallen. Ricardo woke up with a dull ache in his head. He hadn't slept much. The previous night had been filled with restless thoughts, his failures, the woman on the street, his son leaving. Everything felt raw, like an open wound. But there was no time to dwell on it. He had to go back to the office, had to try to keep things from falling apart completely. By midday, Ricardo was at his desk, trying to sort through a pile of paperwork. His assistant knocked and entered the room with a worried expression. "Sir, there's something you should see," she said, handing him a file. Ricardo opened it, his eyes scanning the documents. It was a background report on the homeless woman. He had asked for it, hoping to find something, anything, that would help him understand her situation. As he read, his stomach sank. Her name was Julia. She was the daughter of a man named Manuel, someone Ricardo recognized. He had dealt with Manuel years ago, back when his company was just starting out. Manuel had owned a small business, one that Ricardo's company had taken over as part of an aggressive expansion. It had been a ruthless deal, one that left Manuel with nothing. Ricardo remembered the negotiation clearly. Manuel had come to him, practically begging for a fair settlement. He had a family to support, he had said, but Ricardo hadn't cared. He was young, ambitious, focused solely on growing his company. He had seen Manuel as an obstacle, nothing more. Now, looking at the report, Ricardo felt a wave of nausea. Manuel had died a few years after losing everything. His family had struggled, his wife had fallen ill, and Julia, the daughter, had ended up on the streets after her mother passed away. Ricardo put the file down, his hands trembling. He realized now that the woman he had ignored was someone whose life he had directly destroyed. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. He had taken everything from her family. He had left them with nothing, all for the sake of his company's success. And now, she was out there, suffering, because of decisions he had made. Ricardo stood up abruptly, pacing his office. He felt a rush of panic. The walls felt like they were closing in, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He couldn't breathe. He opened the window, letting the cool air hit his face, trying to steady himself. He had always thought of himself as a strong man, someone who didn't let emotions get in the way of business. But now, the truth of what he had done was unbearable. Later that afternoon, Ricardo received a call from the board of investors. The tension in their voices was palpable. They were concerned about the negative publicity, about the financial stability of the company, about him. "Ricardo, we need you to turn this around," one of the investors said. "You have a few days. If you can't fix this, we'll be forced to consider other options." The meaning was clear. They would replace him if he didn't manage to contain the damage. Ricardo ended the call, his hand gripping the phone tightly. He had always been the one in control. He had built this company from the ground up, sacrificed everything for it. And now, it was slipping away from him. He was slipping away from himself. He needed to do something, but he wasn't sure what. His old tactics wouldn't work. Bribing people, making deals, manipulating the situation. None of that would fix what he had broken. He needed to face the truth, and he needed to make it right. Not for the company, not for the investors, but for himself. That evening, Ricardo made a decision. He had to find Julia. He had to apologize, not as a businessman trying to save face, but as a human being who had done wrong. He knew it wouldn't be easy. She had every reason to hate him, but he had to try. He drove to the shelter where he thought she might be. It was a rundown building, the kind of place Ricardo had never set foot in. He parked his car and hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding. Then he took a deep breath and walked inside. The shelter was crowded, people huddled together, some lying on makeshift beds, others sitting and talking quietly. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of unwashed clothes and hopelessness. Ricardo felt out of place, his suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to everything around him. He approached the front desk, where a tired-looking woman greeted him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in his appearance. "I'm looking for someone," Ricardo said. "Her name is Julia." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Julia? She's here, but why do you want to see her?" Ricardo hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain. "I need to apologize to her. I've done her wrong, and I need to make it right." The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Wait here." A few minutes later, Julia appeared. She looked wary, her eyes narrowing as she saw Ricardo standing there. "You again?" she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "What do you want now?" Ricardo swallowed, feeling a lump in his throat. "I need to talk to you. Please, just give me a minute." Julia crossed her arms, her expression hard. "Why should I? You've done enough already." "I know," Ricardo said, his voice cracking slightly. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've taken everything from you, and I can't change that. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not because of the media, not because of my company, because I am truly sorry." Julia stared at him, her face unreadable. For a moment, there was silence between them, the noise of the shelter fading into the background. Then she spoke. her voice low. "You think an apology will change anything? You destroyed my family. My father lost everything because of you. My mother died, and I ended up on the streets. Do you have any idea what that's like?" Ricardo felt tears sting his eyes. He shook his head. "No, I don't. And I know that nothing I say can ever make it right. But I want to try. I want to help. If you'll let me." Julia looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, pain, and something else, something softer. "Help," she said, her voice almost mocking. "You think you can help now? After everything?" Ricardo nodded. "I know it's too late. I know I can't undo what I did. But I want to do something, anything, to help you now. Not because I want forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do." Julia sighed, shaking her head. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if you're serious, if you really want to help, then maybe, just maybe, I'll let you try." Ricardo felt a weight lift from his shoulders, though the heaviness in his chest remained. He nodded, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Thank you. I promise I won't let you down." Julia gave him a long, hard look. "We'll see about that," she said, turning away and disappearing back into the shelter. Ricardo stood there for a moment, the noise of the shelter returning, filling the silence. He knew this was only the beginning. He had a long way to go, and he wasn't sure if he would ever be able to make things right. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. A path that wasn't about power or money, but about being a better man. Ricardo returned to the shelter the next day. He had spent the entire night thinking about Julia, her words, her pain. He knew that if he wanted to make a difference, he couldn't just show up once and leave. He needed to be consistent, needed to show her that he was serious. It wasn't about saving face anymore. It was about making amends for the damage he had caused. As he walked through the shelter's doors, he caught sight of Julia sitting in a corner, her head lowered as she spoke with another woman. Ricardo took a deep breath, approached slowly, and cleared his throat to catch her attention. Julia looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly when she saw him. "You again?" she said, her voice tinged with skepticism. "What do you want now?" "I want to help," Ricardo said, his tone calm. "If you'll let me." Julia studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Fine, but I'm not going to make it easy for you." "Fair enough," Ricardo replied, trying to smile, though the tension between them made it difficult. He looked around, taking in the rundown state of the shelter, the cracked walls, the worn-out furniture, the hopeless expressions on people's faces. "Is there anything I can do here? Anything that needs fixing?" Julia let out a small, almost exasperated laugh. "Everything needs fixing, but you can start by helping serve lunch." She pointed towards a group of volunteers setting up a table at the far end of the room. Ricardo nodded and made his way over, rolling up his sleeves. He felt the eyes of the people in the shelter on him, curious, skeptical. It wasn't every day that a man in an expensive suit showed up to serve food. He knew they were watching, waiting to see if he was serious or just putting on a show. He worked quietly, taking trays of food from the kitchen and handing them out to the resident. The line was long, the people silent as they shuffled forward. Ricardo looked into their faces, each one tired, each one carrying a story of struggle. It made him realize just how far removed he had been from the reality of the world outside his office. These weren't just numbers on a financial report, they were people. People who had been hurt, ignored, forgotten, and he had played a part in that. Julia watched him from a distance, her expression guarded. She didn't say much, but Ricardo could sense that she was observing his every move. He didn't blame her for being skeptical. He knew he had to prove himself, not with words, but with actions. After a while, Julia approached him. "Not bad for your first day," she said, her voice carrying a hint of sarcasm. "But this isn't charity work for the sake of feeling good about yourself. You know that, right?" Ricardo nodded, looking directly at her. "I know. I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I want to earn that trust." Julia's eyes softened, just for a moment, before she turned away. "We'll see," she muttered, walking off to help another resident. Later that day, Ricardo sat in the common area of the shelter, his sleeves still rolled up, his hands sore from hours of work. He looked around, taking in the environment. It was a place filled with people who had nowhere else to go, people who had been left behind by society. He saw the children playing in the corner, their laughter an odd contrast to the tired expressions on the adults' faces. Julia approached, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Ricardo, her expression still guarded but less hostile than before. "I thought you could use a break," she said. "Thanks," Ricardo replied, taking the cup. They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the shelter surrounding them. Ricardo cleared his throat, glancing at Julia. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he began, his voice uncertain. "About how I destroyed your family. I know I can't change what I did, but I want to try to make things right." Julia looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "You really think you can make it right? My father lost everything because of you. My mother died not long after, and I ended up here. You think showing up and serving lunch is enough to make up for that?" Ricardo shook his head. "No, it's not. I know that. But I want to do more. I want to help, however I can." Julia let out a sigh, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Ricardo. You took everything from us. My father worked his entire life for that business, and you took it away without a second thought." Ricardo swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat. "I know, and I'm sorry. I was young, ambitious, and I didn't care who I hurt along the way. But now, I see what I did, and I hate it. I hate the person I was. I just want a chance to do better." Julia looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft. "Maybe you can help, but it's going to take more than just words, Ricardo. You need to show me that you've changed." "I will," Ricardo said, his voice steady. "I promise." Julia nodded, a small, hesitant smile crossing her lips. "We'll see." The next morning, Ricardo found himself back at the shelter. He was there before most of the residents had even woken up, wanting to show Julia that he was serious. He helped set up breakfast, working alongside the other volunteers, his hands moving automatically as he thought about everything that had happened. Julia approached him after a while, her expression unreadable. "You're early," she said, her voice neutral. "I wanted to help," Ricardo replied simply. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Come with me. There's something I want you to see." She led him outside, to a small garden behind the shelter. It was overgrown, the weeds thick and tangled. Julia gestured towards it. "This was my mother's project," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. She loved gardening. She wanted to make this place beautiful for the people who lived here. But after she died, no one kept it up. Ricardo looked at the garden, his heart aching. He could see the remnants of what had once been something beautiful. Flowers that had withered, a bench that was now broken and worn. He turned to Julia. "I'll help fix it," he said, his voice sincere. "We can bring it back to life." Julia looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and pain. "You think you can just fix everything?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. "It's not that easy, Ricardo." "I know," he said quietly, "but I want to try. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to at least make something good out of the damage I caused." Julia nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "All right, let's see what you've got." They spent the rest of the morning working in the garden, pulling weeds, clearing out the dead plants. It was hard work, and Ricardo's hands were soon blistered, his back sore, but he didn't complain. He could see the determination in Julia's eyes, the way she worked tirelessly, her hands moving with a purpose. She wanted to honor her mother, to bring back something that had been lost, and Ricardo wanted to help her do that. As they worked, they spoke in short bursts, Julia telling him about her mother, Ricardo sharing stories about his own past, about the mistakes he had made and the things he regretted. It was awkward at times, the tension between them still present, but there were moments when they connected, moments when the anger and pain seemed to fade, even if just for a little while. By the end of the day, they had made progress. The garden still had a long way to go, but it was a start. Julia looked at Ricardo, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe you're not as hopeless as I thought," she said, her tone teasing. Ricardo smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. "Maybe not," he replied. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't redemption, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. Ricardo arrived at his office early, the sun barely rising over the city skyline. He sat at his desk, staring at the financial reports in front of him. But his mind wasn't focused on numbers, charts, or the usual business matters that had once consumed him. Instead, his thoughts drifted to Julia, to the shelter, and the work they had started together in the garden. It was strange, almost unsettling, to realize that his priorities were shifting. But it felt right. He knew that if he was going to make a real difference, it couldn't just be about helping at the shelter. He had to change the way he ran his company. He had to be transparent, ethical, and make sure that his decisions didn't come at the expense of others. It wouldn't be easy. His company had been built on ruthless ambition, and there would be resistance, but he was ready to face it. Ricardo called his team into the conference room, the familiar faces of his executives looking at him with curiosity and, perhaps, a bit of concern. He knew they were aware of the bad press, the client withdrawals, and the financial strain it had put on the company. He took a deep breath, standing at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming in early," Ricardo began, his voice steady but sincere. "I wanted to talk about the direction of the company. Things are changing, and I'm sure you all feel it. We've faced challenges recently, and I take full responsibility for that." He paused, the room silent, every eye on him. Ricardo continued, "We need to adapt, and that means changing the way we do business. From now on, we're going to operate with transparency, fairness, and integrity. No more shady deals, no more cutting corners. We're going to do things right, even if it means smaller margins or slower growth." One of the executives, a man named Carlos, raised his hand. "Ricardo, with all due respect, this is a radical change. Our investors are expecting returns, and our clients aren't here for charity. How do you plan to balance this?" Ricardo nodded. He understood their concerns. He would have asked the same questions not long ago. "I know this isn't what you're used to, and I understand if some of you think this won't work, but I'm not willing to keep running things the way we've been. It's time to prioritize people over profit. If anyone wants to leave, I won't hold it against you. But for those who stay, we're going to build something we can be proud of." Carlos exchanged glances with a few other executives, the tension palpable. Ricardo could feel their doubts, their skepticism, but he was prepared for it. He knew change wouldn't come without resistance, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. After the meeting, Ricardo left the office and headed to the shelter. He had promised Julia he would come by to help, and he intended to keep that promise. When he arrived, he saw Julia in the garden, her hands dirty, her hair tied back, working with quiet determination. He walked over, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, and she looked up, giving him a nod. "Back for more?" she asked, her voice a mix of sarcasm and warmth. Ricardo smiled, grabbing a pair of gloves and kneeling beside her. "You know it." They worked in silence for a while, pulling weeds, turning the soil, planting the new flowers they had bought with donation. It was slow, grueling work, but Ricardo found a strange sense of peace in it. There was something about working with his hands, seeing the immediate results of his efforts, that brought a kind of clarity he hadn't felt in years. "Why are you doing this?" Julia asked suddenly, breaking the silence. She didn't look at him, her focus on the plants in front of her. Ricardo hesitated, wiping sweat from his brow. "Because I need to," he said honestly. "I need to do something good, something that matters. I've spent so much of my life focused on money, power, and I've hurt people. I've hurt you. I can't change the past, but I can try to do better now." Julia looked at him then, her eyes softening just slightly. "It's not easy, you know. Changing, people will doubt you. They'll question your motives." Ricardo nodded. "I know, and I don't blame them. But I'm not doing this for recognition. I'm doing it because I have to live with myself, and I want to be someone I can respect." Julia was quiet for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. "Okay," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "We'll see." The following week, Ricardo returned to the office with a renewed sense of purpose. He called another meeting with the board of investors. The room was filled with tension. These were the people who had backed him, who had trusted him to grow their wealth, and they weren't going to be happy about what he was proposing. "Thank you all for coming," Ricardo said as he stood before them. "I know that recent events have put a strain on our business relationship, and I want to address that." He paused, looking at the faces around the table. Some were impatient, others skeptical. Ricardo took a deep breath. "I've decided that our company will be taking a new direction. We will focus on ethical practices, community involvement, and transparency. It might mean slower growth, but it will also mean doing things the right way." One of the investors, an older man with a stern expression, spoke up. "Ricardo, this isn't what we invested in. We trusted you to deliver results, not charity." Ricardo nodded, his expression serious. "I understand, and if any of you feel that this direction isn't right for you, you're free to withdraw. I won't hold it against you. but this is the only way forward that I can stand behind." The room was silent, the investors exchanging glances. Ricardo knew this was a risk. He could lose their support, lose everything he had built. But he also knew that it was a risk worth taking. After what felt like an eternity, the older investor spoke again, his voice softer. "All right, Ricardo, we'll give you a chance, but understand this. We need to see results, even if they come from doing things differently." Ricardo nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Thank you. I promise you won't regret it." After the meeting, Ricardo returned to the shelter, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He found Julia in the garden again, her hands busy planting a new row of flowers. She looked up as he approached, raising an eyebrow. "How did it go?" she asked. Ricardo smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Better than I expected. They're willing to give me a chance." Julia nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Good. Maybe there's hope for you yet." They worked side by side, the sun setting slowly over the horizon. As they finished for the day, Ricardo looked at the garden, a once neglected, overgrown patch of land that was now starting to come back to life. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, and for the first time, Ricardo felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. "Thank you, Julia," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "For giving me a chance." Julia looked at him, her expression softening. "Don't thank me yet, Ricardo. There's still a long way to go." Ricardo nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "I know, and I'm ready for it." As they stood there, the garden around them filled with the scent of fresh soil and new beginnings, Ricardo realized that this was just the start. There was still so much to do, so many wrongs to make right, so many changes to make, but he was ready. For the first time, he felt like he was on a path worth following. Ricardo arrived at the office the next morning with a sense of cautious optimism. He had a lot to prove, to himself, to Julia, and to everyone around him. The changes he intended to make were no small feat, and he knew that not everyone would be on board. But he was committed. He was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The moment he walked in, Ricardo could sense the tension. Employees were murmuring, their eyes darting towards him before quickly looking away. He could almost feel their doubts hanging in the air. He took a deep breath and made his way to his office, determined to push forward regardless of the skepticism. Carlos, one of the senior executives, knocked on his door soon after Ricardo sat down. "Ricardo, we need to talk," Carlos said as he stepped in, closing the door behind him. "Sure, Carlos. What's on your mind?" Ricardo leaned back, trying to keep his tone neutral. Carlos looked uneasy. "Look, I know you're trying to take the company in a new direction, but people are nervous. They're questioning the future. Clients, employees, even some of us on the executive team. The changes you're making are drastic. We need to know if this is really going to work." Ricardo nodded, understanding Carlos's concern. "I get it, Carlos. Change is never easy, and I know I'm asking a lot of everyone. But this isn't just about the company anymore. It's about doing the right thing, about making sure that what we do here doesn't hurt people." Carlos hesitated, then leaned forward. "But what if doing the right thing means losing everything we've built? What if we can't sustain the company like this?" Ricardo sighed, looking out of the window. "If that happens, then it happens. But I can't keep running this company the way I used to. I won't. If we fail, at least we'll fail knowing we tried to do something good." Carlos was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Ricardo, I'll back you. But you need to know that not everyone will. There are people who will fight this change. They'll want things to go back to the way they were." Ricardo gave a small smile. "I know, but I'm ready for that fight." That evening, Ricardo headed back to the shelter. It had become part of his routine, a place where he felt like he was doing something meaningful. As he walked in, he spotted Julia speaking with a group of volunteers, her expression serious. "Ricardo," Julia called out when she saw him, waving him over. "We could use your help with something." He walked over, curious. Julia gestured to the far side of the room, where several large boxes were stacked. "We got a donation of supplies, but we need to sort through them and organize everything. Think you're up for it?" Ricardo smiled. "Of course." As they began unpacking the boxes, sorting through canned food, clothes, and blankets, Julia glanced at Ricardo. "So, how's the company doing with all the changes you're making?" she asked. Ricardo let out a breath, his hands pausing over a stack of blankets. "It's tough. People are scared, and I don't blame them. I've spent years running things a certain way, and now I'm telling everyone we're changing direction completely. It's hard for people to trust that it's going to work." Julia nodded, her eyes softening slightly. "Change is hard, especially when you're used to things being a certain way for so long. People get comfortable, even if that comfort comes at someone else's expense." Ricardo looked at her, his chest tightening. "I know. I was comfortable for a long time. I thought I was doing what I had to do to succeed, but now, I see how many people I hurt along the way, and I don't want to be that person anymore." Julia gave him a small smile, her eyes filled with a mix of empathy and caution. "It's good that you're trying to change, Ricardo. But remember, it's not just about what you want now. It's about proving to everyone else that you mean it." Ricardo nodded. "I know, and I will." They continued working, the quiet of the shelter filling the space between them. Ricardo could feel the weight of Julia's words, the challenge they represented. It wasn't enough to want change, he had to show it, every single day, through his action. A few days later, Ricardo found himself sitting across from his son in a small cafe. It was the first time they had seen each other since his son decided to move in with his mother. Ricardo had reached out, asking if they could talk, and to his relief, his son had agreed. His son, Lucas, looked older than Ricardo remembered, his eyes filled with a maturity that made Ricardo's heart ache. He had missed so much, had let his work consume him to the point where he had lost touch with the people who mattered most. "Thanks for meeting me, Lucas," Ricardo said, his voice quiet. He felt nervous, more nervous than he had ever felt in any business meeting. This wasn't about numbers or deals. This was about his son, about repairing a relationship that had been damaged by his neglect. Lucas shrugged, his eyes downcast. I figured I'd hear you out." Ricardo took a deep breath. "I know I haven't been a good father. I know I put my work first, and I'm sorry for that. I've made a lot of mistakes, Lucas, and I'm trying to fix them, not just at work, but here, with you." Lucas looked up, his eyes searching Ricardo's face. "Why now, Dad? Why are you suddenly trying to change everything?" Ricardo hesitated, then spoke honestly. "Because I realized that I was losing everything that mattered. I was so focused on success, on money, that I forgot about the people I care about. I don't want to lose you, Lucas. I want to be part of your life again, if you'll let me." Lucas was silent for a moment, then sighed. "I don't know, Dad. It's hard to trust you. You've said things like this before, but nothing ever changed." Ricardo nodded, the pain of his son's words hitting him hard. "I understand, and I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I'm going to prove it to you, Lucas. I'm going to show you that I mean it this time." Lucas looked at him, his expression softening just a bit. "I guess we'll see then." Ricardo smiled, a small glimmer of hope filling his chest. It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start, and that was enough for now. Back at the office, Ricardo faced another challenge. One of the company's largest clients had called, expressing concerns about the new direction Ricardo was taking. They were considering pulling their investment, worried that the focus on ethical practices would hurt their returns. Ricardo sat across from the client, his posture calm but firm. "I understand your concerns," he said, his voice steady. "But I believe that this new direction is the right one, not just for the company, but for our clients as well. We want to be a company that people can trust, that operates with integrity. In the long run, that kind of reputation will bring value to everyone involved." The client frowned, clearly unconvinced. "And what if it doesn't work out that way? What if your new ethical practices end up costing us?" Ricardo held the client's gaze, his expression unwavering. "Then I'll take responsibility, but I'm willing to take that risk, because I believe it's the right thing to do." There was a long pause, the tension thick in the air. Finally, the client let out a sigh. "All right, Ricardo, I'll give you a chance, but I want to see results. And I mean real results." Ricardo nodded, a sense of determination filling him. "You will, I promise." That evening, Ricardo returned to the shelter once again. He found Julia in the garden, her hands covered in dirt, as she worked to plant new flowers. She looked up as he approached, giving him a nod. "How's the company doing?" she asked, her tone neutral. "It's tough," Ricardo admitted. "People are questioning the changes. Clients are threatening to leave, but I'm not backing down. I'm committed to making this work." Julia studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good, because if you're serious about changing, you're going to have to fight for it, not just once, but every day." Ricardo smiled, kneeling down beside her to help. "I know, and I'm ready." They worked side by side, the garden slowly coming to life around them. Ricardo felt the weight of the day's challenge, but also a sense of hope. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be more setbacks, more doubts, but he was determined to keep moving forward, to keep proving himself, not just to Julia, not just to his son, but to himself. He looked at the garden, the flowers blooming despite the rocky soil, and he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Ricardo stood at the entrance of his office, looking out at the familiar rows of cubicles and busy employees. It had been a week since his meeting with the investors, and the pressure hadn't eased. He could feel the tension every time he walked through the building, whispers, sideways glances, the underlying fear that everything they knew was about to change. He took a deep breath and walked into the office floor. He needed to face his team, to show them that he was serious about the changes and that he was willing to lead by example. He stopped by one of the cubicles, a young analyst named Maria looking up at him with wide eyes. "Morning, Maria," Ricardo said with a small smile. "Can you gather the rest of the team in the conference room? I'd like to speak with everyone." Maria nodded, her expression curious, and quickly started spreading the word. Within minutes, the conference room filled with employees, all of them looking at Ricardo expectantly. He took his place at the front of the room, feeling the weight of their expectation. "Thank you all for coming in," Ricardo began, his voice steady. "I know that the past few weeks have been uncertain, and I want to address some of the concerns you all might have." He paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could. He needed them to see that he was genuine, that he wasn't just paying lip service. "We're making changes, and I know that can be scary. We're going to operate with integrity, with transparency, and we're going to put people first. I'm asking all of you to join me in this. It won't be easy. We'll have setbacks, and there will be times when it feels like we're losing. But I believe that we can do this, that we can be a company we're proud to work for." There was silence for a moment, and then one of the senior employees, Carla, spoke up. "Ricardo, how do we know this isn't just a phase? How do we know that you won't change your mind if things get tough?" Ricardo nodded, appreciating the honesty of the question. "You're right to be skeptical. I know I haven't always been the leader you deserved. I've made mistakes, big ones, and I understand if it's hard to trust me. But I'm committed to this, and I'm going to prove it every day. Not just with words, but with actions." He could see the uncertainty in their faces, the cautious hope. He knew trust wasn't built overnight, and he was prepared to earn it back, step by step. After the meeting, Ricardo returned to his office, his heart pounding. It had been nerve-wracking to stand in front of his employees and admit his mistakes, but it also felt right. He knew that he couldn't just demand their trust, he had to earn it, just as he was trying to earn Julia's. Later that afternoon, Ricardo received a call from one of his clients. It was a client he had worked with for years, someone who had always appreciated Ricardo's aggressive business style. He knew this call wouldn't be easy. "Ricardo, I've heard about the changes you're making," the client began, his tone cautious. "I have to say, I'm not sure this new direction is what's best for us." Ricardo took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I understand your concerns, and I know this is a big shift, but I believe that operating ethically, with transparency, is what will bring long-term value, not just for my company, but for yours as well. I'm asking you to trust me on this." There was a long pause, and Ricardo could almost hear the wheels turning in the client's mind. Finally, the client spoke. "All right, Ricardo, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt, for now, but you need to show me that this will work." "I will," Ricardo promised. "Thank you for giving me this chance." After the call ended, Ricardo leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a loss either. It was a step forward, and that was all he could ask for right now. That evening, Ricardo made his way to the shelter once more. He had promised Julia he would come by to help with the garden, and he intended to keep his promise. As he walked through the doors, he saw Julia standing near the garden, talking with another volunteer. When she saw Ricardo, she gave him a nod. "Back again?" she asked, her tone carrying a mix of teasing and respect. "Of course," Ricardo replied, grabbing a pair of gloves. "I told you, I'm not going anywhere." Julia smiled, a genuine smile that made Ricardo feel like he was finally making progress. They worked side by side, pulling weeds, planting flowers, their hands moving with a sense of purpose. The garden was slowly coming back to life, bright colors starting to replace the dullness that had taken over. "Your company, how's it doing?" Julia asked after a while, her eyes still focused on the soil in front of her. "It's a challenge," Ricardo admitted. "Some clients are on board, others aren't. And my team, they're skeptical. They're waiting to see if I really mean it." Julia nodded, glancing at him. "And do you?" Ricardo looked at her, his expression serious. "Yes, I do. I've hurt a lot of people, Julia, and I'm trying to make things right. It's not going to happen overnight, and I know I won't get it right all the time, but I'm committed to this." Julia studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Good, because if you're serious about this, you're going to have to fight for it. Every single day." Ricardo smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "I know, and I'm ready for that fight." The next day, Ricardo received news that one of the company's key investors was planning to pull out. It was a major blow, one that could potentially cripple the company if he couldn't find a way to turn it around. Ricardo knew he needed to act fast. He called the investor, setting up a meeting for later that afternoon. As he entered the investor's office, Ricardo could feel the tension in the air. The investor, a stern-faced man named Robert, greeted him with a curt nod. "Ricardo, I'm not sure about this new direction you're taking," Robert began, his tone blunt. "We've been partners for years, and I've always trusted your judgment. But this, it's risky, and I'm not sure it's the right move." Ricardo nodded, taking a seat across from Robert. "I understand your concerns, Robert, but I truly believe that this is the right path, not just for the company, but for our clients and our community. I know it's a risk, but I'm asking you to trust me, just like you always have." Robert frowned, leaning back in his chair. "You're asking me to risk a lot here, Ricardo. I need to see something concrete, something that shows me this isn't just a gamble." Ricardo thought for a moment, then spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I can't promise immediate results, Robert, but what I can promise is that I'm doing this for the right reasons. I want this company to be something we can all be proud of, and if you give me the chance, I'll show you that this is the way forward." Robert was silent for a long moment, then he sighed. "All right, Ricardo, I'll give you a little more time, but you need to show me that this will work. I'm not willing to lose everything we've built." Ricardo nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Robert. I won't let you down." As Ricardo left the investor's office, he felt a sense of determination fill him. He knew this wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more doubts, but he was ready to face them. He was ready to fight for the company, for his employees, for Julia, and for himself. That evening, Ricardo returned to the shelter, feeling the weight of the day's challenges but also the hope that he was making progress. He found Julia in the garden, her hands covered in dirt, her expression focused. When she saw him, she gave him a nod. "How did it go?" she asked, her tone cautious. "It was tough," Ricardo admitted, kneeling down beside her. "But I think I'm starting to get through to people. It's going to take time, but I'm not giving up." Julia smiled, a small, approving smile. "Good, because if you're serious about changing, you can't give up. Not now, not ever." Ricardo nodded, his heart swelling with determination. "I won't." They worked together, the sun setting slowly behind them, the garden blooming with new life. Ricardo knew that his journey was far from over, that there were still battles to be fought, still people to win over, still wrongs to make right, but he also knew that he was on the right path. For the first time in a long time, Ricardo felt a sense of peace. He was no longer running from his past, no longer hiding behind his power and his wealth. He was facing the consequences of his actions, and he was determined to be a better man. And that, he realized, was worth everything. Ricardo walked into his apartment, the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. The office had been tense, as usual, and the shelter had its own challenges. But it wasn't the kind of pressure he had felt before. This was different. There was purpose behind it now, a sense of trying to do right by the people around him. He moved through the spacious apartment, its luxurious decor almost out of place now. He had built this life out of a desire for wealth and power, and as he looked around, Ricardo realized that it wasn't what he wanted anymore. He didn't need all of this. He didn't need the expensive art, the marble countertops, the designer furniture. It was just stuff. It didn't mean anything. Ricardo made a decision. He walked over to his desk, picked up his phone, and called his realtor. "I want to sell the apartment," he said, his voice steady. There was a pause on the other end. Then the realtor's voice came through, surprised. "Sell, sir? Are you sure? Positive, Ricardo replied. I'm downsizing. I don't need all of this. The realtor agreed, though Ricardo could hear the confusion in his voice, but Ricardo didn't care. He had spent so much of his life accumulating things, wealth, property, power, but now he realized that none of it had brought him the kind of fulfillment he had found in the shelter, in the garden, in the simple act of trying to help others. A few days later, Ricardo moved into a smaller apartment. It wasn't anything like his old place, no lavish decorations, no expansive views of the city. It was modest, simple, but it felt right. He unpacked his belongings slowly, the quiet of the new space soothing. There were no reminders of his old life here, nothing that tied him to the man he used to be. It was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild. That evening, Ricardo returned to the shelter, feeling a sense of calm that he hadn't experienced in a long time. As he walked through the doors, he saw Julia sitting at one of the tables, talking to a few of the residents. She looked up when she saw him, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. "You look different," she said as he approached. Ricardo smiled, taking a seat across from her. "I sold the apartment. I moved into a smaller place." Julia raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Why?" "Because I don't need all of that," Ricardo replied honestly. "It was just stuff. It didn't make me happy. I want to focus on what matters now." Julia studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That's a big change," Ricardo shrugged. "It feels right." They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the shelter filling the space around them. Then Julia spoke, her voice softer. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day when you would be here, doing this. It's strange, but it's good." Ricardo smiled, a warmth spreading through him. "I never thought I'd be here either, but I'm glad I am." Julia gave him a small smile, her eyes softening. "Maybe you're finally figuring out what matters." "Maybe," Ricardo said, his voice quiet. The next morning, Ricardo called his son, Lucas. They hadn't spoken much since their last meeting, but Ricardo was determined to keep trying. He knew it would take time, but he wanted to be part of his son's life again. "Hey, Dad," Lucas answered, his voice cautious. "Hey, Lucas," Ricardo said, his heart pounding. "I was wondering if you'd like to come see the new place. I've moved into a smaller apartment, and I'd love for you to come by." There was a pause, and Ricardo held his breath, waiting for his son's response. Finally, Lucas spoke, his voice soft. "Yeah, okay, I'll come by." Ricardo smiled, relief washing over him. "Great. I'll text you the address. I'm really looking forward to it." "Me too," Lucas said, his tone still hesitant but genuine. After ending the call, Ricardo leaned back in his chair, a sense of hope filling him. It was a small step, but it was progress. He knew that rebuilding his relationship with Lucas would take time, but he was willing to do whatever it took. That afternoon, Ricardo arrived at the office, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He had another meeting with the board of investors, and he knew it was going to be a difficult one. They were still unsure about the changes he was making, still questioning whether this new direction would work. Ricardo stood at the head of the conference table, looking at the investors seated before him. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady. "I know that the changes we're making are significant, and I understand your concerns, but I want to assure you that we're on the right path." One of the investors, Robert, leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Ricardo, we need to see results. We need to know that this isn't going to sink the company." Ricardo nodded. "I understand, and I'm working on it. We've made progress, and I believe that in the long run, this new direction will benefit not just our company, but our clients and our community as well. It's about building something sustainable, something we can be proud of." There was silence for a moment, the tension in the room palpable. Then Robert spoke, his tone cautious. "All right, Ricardo, we'll give you more time, but we need to see progress. We can't afford to take risks without results." "You will," Ricardo promised. "I'm committed to making this work." The meeting ended, and Ricardo felt a sense of determination fill him. He knew he had a long way to go, that there were still people to convince, still battles to fight, but he was ready for it. He was ready to prove that this new direction wasn't just a gamble, it was the future. That evening, Ricardo returned to the shelter once again. He found Julia in the garden, her hands covered in dirt as she worked to plant new flowers. She looked up as he approached, giving him a nod. "How did it go with the investors?" she asked, her tone neutral. "It went all right," Ricardo replied, grabbing a pair of gloves and kneeling beside her. "They're giving me more time. They want results, and I intend to give them that. Julia smiled, a small smile that made Ricardo's heart swell. Good. You're making progress, Ricardo. Just don't lose sight of why you're doing this. I won't, Ricardo said, his voice filled with determination. They worked side by side, the garden slowly transforming into something beautiful. The once overgrown patch of land was now filled with flowers, the colors bright and vibrant. It was a symbol of hope, of new beginnings, and Ricardo couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in what they had accomplished. As they finished for the day, Ricardo looked at Julia, his expression sincere. Thank you, Julia, for giving me a chance, for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it. Julia looked at him, her eyes softening. You've earned it, Ricardo. You're not the same man you used to be, and that's a good thing. Ricardo smiled, a warmth spreading through him. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was worth it. He had lost so much, his relationships, his reputation, his sense of self, but now, he was rebuilding. He was finding meaning in the simple things, in the connections he had once taken for granted, and for the first time, Ricardo felt like he was truly living, not just existing, not just chasing power or wealth, but living a life that mattered. He knew there would still be challenges, still be setbacks, but he was ready for them. He was ready to keep fighting, to keep moving forward. He looked at the garden, the flowers blooming despite the hardships they had faced, and he felt a sense of peace. It was a reminder that even in the face of adversity, beauty could still grow, and that, to Ricardo, was worth everything. Ricardo stood in the middle of his new apartment, looking around at the simple furnishings and the few boxes he had left to unpack. It was a far cry from the opulence he had once surrounded himself with, but it felt right. There was a sense of calm here that he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense that he was finally on the path he was meant to be on. He had spent the past few weeks focusing on the changes in his company, on his work at the shelter, and on reconnecting with his son. It wasn't easy. Every day was a challenge, a test of his commitment to the new life he was building. But he felt more fulfilled now than he ever had when he was at the peak of his wealth and power. There was a knock on the door, and Ricardo opened it to find Lucas standing there, his hands in his pockets, looking a little unsure of himself. "Hey, Dad," Lucas said, a small smile playing at his lips. "Hey, Lucas," Ricardo replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Come on in. I'm glad you could make it." Lucas walked in, looking around the apartment. "This is different," he said, his tone curious. Ricardo smiled. "Yeah, it is. I realized I didn't need all that space, all that stuff. It was just getting in the way of what really matters." Lucas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think it's nice. It feels, more like you now." Ricardo felt a warmth spread through his chest. "Thanks, son. I'm trying to make things right. Not just with work, but with you too. I want to be part of your life, Lucas, if you'll let me." Lucas looked at his father, his eyes filled with emotion. "I want that too, Dad. I know it's going to take time, but I'm willing to try." Ricardo nodded, his voice filled with emotion. "That's all I could ever ask for." They spent the afternoon together, talking, laughing, sharing stories. It was simple, but it was everything Ricardo had been missing. He had spent so many years chasing after success that he had lost sight of what really mattered. But now, sitting here with his son, he knew that he was finally getting it right. The next day, Ricardo returned to the office, feeling a sense of determination. He had another meeting with his executive team, and he knew that this was an opportunity to reinforce the changes they were making. He stood at the front of the room, looking at the familiar faces of his team. "Thank you all for coming," Ricardo began, his voice steady. "I want to thank you for your support and your patience as we continue to navigate these changes. I know it hasn't been easy, and I know there have been doubts, but I believe that we are on the right path, and I want you all to know how much I appreciate your hard work and commitment." Carlos, one of the senior executives, raised his hand. "Ricardo, I think I speak for everyone when I say that we've noticed a change in you, and I think we're all starting to see the value in what you're trying to do. It's different, but it feels like we're doing something important." Ricardo smiled, a sense of pride filling him. "That's exactly what I want. I want us to be proud of the work we're doing, not just for our clients, but for our community, for each other. We're building something that matters, and I couldn't do it without all of you." The room filled with nods, and Ricardo felt a surge of hope. He knew that there would still be challenges ahead, that there would still be setbacks and moments of doubt, but he also knew that they were building something real, something meaningful. That evening, Ricardo returned to the shelter. He had been coming here almost every day, and it had become a place of comfort for him. As he walked through the doors, he saw Julia standing by the garden, her hands on her hips, surveying their work. "Hey, Julia!" Ricardo called out, making his way over to her. Julia turned, a smile spreading across her face when she saw him. "Hey, Ricardo, just admiring the garden. It's really starting to come together." Ricardo looked at the garden, the flowers blooming brightly, the green leaves vibrant and full of life. "Yeah, it is," he said, his voice filled with pride. "We did good." Julia nodded, her expression softening. "You know, when you first came here, I didn't think you'd stick around. I thought you'd do your part, make a show of it, and then disappear. But you've proven me wrong, Ricardo. You've really changed." Ricardo looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. "I had to change. I couldn't keep living the way I was. I couldn't keep hurting people, ignoring the damage I was causing. I'm trying to make things right, Julia. For you, for Lucas, for everyone I've hurt." Julia reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're doing it, Ricardo. You're making a difference, and I think my father would be proud of you." Ricardo felt tears welling up in his eyes, and he swallowed hard, his voice cracking slightly. "Thank you, Julia. That means more to me than you'll ever know." Julia smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "Come on, let's finish up here. We've still got work to do." They worked together, side by side, the sun setting behind them. The garden was almost complete now, the once overgrown patch of land transformed into something beautiful. It was a symbol of everything Ricardo had been through, a journey of redemption, of rebuilding, of finding hope where there had once been none. As they finished for the evening, Ricardo looked at Julia, his expression sincere. "Thank you, Julia, for giving me a chance, for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it." Julia looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion. "You earned it, Ricardo. You're not the same man you used to be, and that's a good thing." Ricardo smiled, a warmth spreading through him. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was worth it. He had lost so much, his relationships, his reputation, his sense of self, but now he was rebuilding. He was finding meaning in the simple things, in the connections he had once taken for granted. And for the first time, Ricardo felt like he was truly living, not just existing, not just chasing power or wealth, but living a life that mattered. He knew there would still be challenges, still be setbacks, but he was ready for them. He was ready to keep fighting, to keep moving forward. He looked at the garden, the flowers blooming despite the hardships they had faced, and he felt a sense of peace. It was a reminder that even in the face of adversity, beauty could still grow. And that, to Ricardo, was worth everything. As he stood there, the shelter bustling around him, Ricardo knew that this was just the beginning. There was still work to be done, still people to help, still wrongs to make right. But he was ready. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. And that, he realized, was the greatest success of all.